You're coming with me. That's what the rancher said to the giant widow after the town took off all her clothes. 4 words. Just 4 words that cut through the hate like a hot knife. They had stripped her bare in the dust. They called her a killer because she was bigger than the man she buried. They branded her a monster because her shoulders were broad and her hands were strong. The people of Dry Willow dragged her into the town square and decided she was guilty without a trial, without a jury, without a shred of mercy. They said she'd crushed her husband with her bare hands. They said no woman should be that size and still expect a gentle word. They said she was a beast that needed to be put down, and so they tried. They spat on her. They threw rocks. They tore the simple cotton dress from her back until she stood there in the red dirt, with nothing left but the bruises blooming on her skin, and a silence that was louder than all their shouting. Nobody stopped them. Not the sheriff, not the preacher, not a single soul with a conscience. Until Abel Ward stepped through the crowd. He didn't wear a badge. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked, a man scarred by war and loss, a man who hadn't set foot in town for 2 long winters. He walked straight up to the woman they had tried to erase, and he put his worn coat over her shoulders. He did it gently, like it was Sunday morning, and he was helping his wife get ready for church. Then he took her hand. That simple act cracked the air wide open. The laughing stopped. The yelling died in their throats. The whole town just stood there, stunned into silence, watching a man who never spoke to anyone claim the woman they had all condemned. He looked at her, his eyes calm in his weathered face, and he said it again. Just for her this time. You're coming with me. Her name was Mara, but he didn't know that yet. She stood there trembling, knees wobbling, but she didn't fall. Her face was a mask of stone, not a single tear. Her arms were crossed tight over her chest, holding herself together. She didn't answer him. She didn't need to. She just let him lead her out of that hateful circle. She walked barefoot, her feet bleeding onto the dusty ground. The coat, too big for even her, dragged behind them like a broken flag of surrender. But her back was straight. She never once looked back at the faces of the people who had shamed her, and nobody dared to follow them. Not that day. The walk to his ranch was long and silent. The sun beat down on them, blistering the dry earth. Neither of them spoke, but a strange understanding passed between them. It was the language of the broken, a silent promise between 2 people who knew what it felt like to be judged by whispers and lies. It was a rope thrown between 2 sinking ships in the middle of a storm. When they reached the ranch, a small wooden cabin hunkered down against the wind, she stopped. She stared at it like it was a foreign country, a place that didn't know the ugly names they'd called her, and maybe that was a good thing. Abel opened the door and stood aside, waiting. She didn't move. You got a name? He asked, his voice quiet, raspy from disuse. She finally looked at him. Her eyes were swollen and bloodshot, but they were alive. There was a fire in them that the whole town couldn't put out. Mara, she said. Come on in, Mara. The cabin was sparse. 1 room, a table with 2 chairs, a neatly made bed covered in a thin layer of dust. On a shelf, a single photograph sat in a simple wooden frame. A smiling woman, a younger, happier Abel, and a small boy. A ghost family, trapped in a memory that never got dusted. Mara's bloody feet left faint red prints on the wooden floorboards. She felt like an intruder, a stain on this quiet place of sorrow. Abel seemed to sense it. He turned away, giving her space. There's a clean dress behind that curtain, he said, his back to her. It was my wife's. It might fit. If not, we'll figure something out. She didn't answer. He stepped out onto the porch and closed the door softly behind him, leaving her alone with the ghosts. Outside, the quiet was absolute. All he could hear was the wind sighing over the fence rails and the slow, heavy beat of his own heart. His hands were shaking. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it, and watched the flame burn all the way down to his fingertips without lighting anything. He just needed to see a single, steady light in the growing darkness. Behind the closed door, he heard the soft splash of water pouring into a basin. Then, a long silence. Then, the soft tread of footsteps. When Mara came out onto the porch, she was wearing the dress. It was a simple blue cotton, and it strained at the seams across her powerful shoulders, but it covered her. Her arms were a roadmap of scratches, and her knees were bruised purple, but she was clean and she was dressed. Her long, dark hair was pulled back from her face, and her eyes, though still raw, were clear. She didn't sit. She walked to the edge of the porch and stood there looking out at the endless, unforgiving land. She looked like a queen who had lost her kingdom. Abel finally broke the silence. "They said you killed him." "I know," she said, her voice a low rumble. "Did you believe them?" She turned her head just enough to look at him. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," he said. She watched him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face, looking for the lie, for the pity, for the judgment she'd seen in every other face in Dry Willow. She found none of it. "Why?" she asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why don't you believe them?" "Because I've seen killers," Abel said, his voice flat and hard with memory. "And you're not one." That seemed to break something in her. She walked over to the small wooden table on the porch, sat down heavily in one of the chairs, and finally looked him straight in the face. He went inside, came back with 2 cups of steaming black coffee, and sat across from her. "Tell me what happened," he said. It wasn't a demand. It was an invitation. Mara's throat worked. She hadn't had a sip of water all day, but she began to speak anyway, her voice cracked and dry. "He was drunk again. Silas was always drunk. He thought I was hiding money from him. I wasn't. There was never any money to hide." She stared down into the black coffee, as if the story was written in the steam. "He threw the skillet at me. It missed. Then he hit me. Twice. He told me I'd better cry like a real woman or he'd give me something to cry about." Her gaze lifted from the cup and met Abel's. "I didn't cry." Abel just nodded once. He understood. Crying was a luxury some people couldn't afford. "I just held him back," she continued. "I put my hands on his chest to stop him. I didn't even push him hard. But he was clumsy drunk. He stumbled backward, tripped over the woodpile behind the cabin. He fell wrong. His head hit the corner of the chopping block." Her voice finally broke. "That's what killed him. The fall." She blinked, and a single tear, the one she'd refused to shed for the town, traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. "Do you believe me?" "I already told you I did," Abel said softly. Mara shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "That don't mean much in a place like this. Words are cheap." Abel leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, his eyes locked on hers. "You're right. It doesn't mean a thing to them. But it means something here, in this house, on this land. My word isn't cheap." She bit her lip, her jaw tight. "They'll come again. They won't let this go." "They will," Abel agreed, his voice grim. "They'll say I'm a monster. They'll try to lock me up or worse." "They might try." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind. Finally, she asked the question that had been burning in her mind since he'd first draped his coat over her shoulders. "Why are you helping me, Abel Ward?" He stared at his coffee for a long time, the memories swirling in his mind like the steam from his cup. When he finally spoke, it was the plain, unvarnished truth. "Because nobody helped my wife," he said, "and I will live with what that cost me until the day I die." That was the first time Mara's composure truly shattered. Her lip trembled violently, and she clenched her jaw so tight he could see the muscles bunch. She didn't cry, not with sound, but her whole body shook with the effort of holding it in. She gave him a single, sharp nod. And in that moment, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else, something alive. That night, Abel gave her the bed. He didn't ask her, he didn't offer. He simply pointed to it and then rolled out a thick wool blanket for himself on the floor near the cold hearth. Mara didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because the words were stuck somewhere in her throat, tangled up with a pain so deep she didn't know how to let it out. She laid on her side, fully clothed in his dead wife's dress, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling. Her body ached from the mauling in town, but her mind was racing, circling back again and again to the same question. Why him? Why did this one silent, broken man see her when no one else even bothered to look? She didn't know, not yet, that Abel Ward had buried his wife, Sarah, and their 5-year-old son, Daniel, 3 winters ago, right under the gnarled mesquite tree out back. She didn't know that the town blamed him for it. They whispered that he was too proud to ride for the doctor when the fever came, that he'd let them die rather than ask for help. The same people who had stripped Mara naked had once whispered that Abel Ward was a killer too, and Abel didn't know that Mara had once been a midwife, that she had brought 14 babies into the world in 4 different counties before Silas, in a jealous rage, had forbidden it. He didn't know that the strength in her arms wasn't for hurting, but for holding, that she had once carried a sick child 5 miles through a blizzard to the nearest clinic while the boy's father lay passed out drunk in a ditch. They didn't know each other's stories. They only knew the sharp, bitter taste of being misjudged. They knew silence. And for tonight, in this small, dusty cabin at the edge of the world, that was enough. In the deep darkness, just before dawn, Mara's voice cut through the quiet. They're not done with me. Abel, who hadn't been sleeping either, stared into the dying embers in the hearth. No, he said, his voice a low growl. Next time, they'll come with ropes. He let out a long, slow breath. Let them try. The fire popped, spitting a single spark into the darkness. It was the only answer the world gave them back. At dawn, Mara was already outside. Abel watched from the window as she took an old rake from the barn and began clearing the dead leaves from around the porch. Her movements were slow, stiff, with pain. He could see the makeshift bandages she'd wrapped around her ankles, but she didn't stop. When she bent down to pick up a fallen bucket, he saw her flinch, her body seizing up. She paused, steadied herself against the porch rail, and then lifted the heavy bucket anyway, not because she was healed, but because some part of her refused to be seen as weak. Not ever again. Later, as she was boiling water for coffee over the fire, she asked him, "What do you grow here?" Abel was sharpening an axe blade, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the small yard. "Barley," he said without looking up, "and bones." Mara blinked. Bones? He finally stopped and met her gaze. He wasn't smiling. A lot of things die out here. The land remembers every one of them. It holds grudges. She didn't flinch. A slow, grim smile touched her lips. Then it ought to love me. I've buried more than my share. The air between them crackled with unspoken things. He finally looked her square in the eyes. You want to stay? Mara stirred the boiling water with a stick. I don't have anywhere else to go. That's not what I asked, he said, his voice quiet but firm. She stopped stirring. Her big, capable hands tightened around the stick until her knuckles were white. She looked up from the fire, her eyes meeting his across the yard. I want to stay. He gave her a single, sharp nod. Then you'll work, and you'll eat, and you'll be safe here. Mara's voice dropped, the fire gone out of it, replaced by a cold dread. What about them? The town? They're cowards, Abel said, turning back to his axe. And cowards always bark loudest the day after they fail. He was wrong. They didn't wait a day. That very afternoon, while Mara was down at the creek washing the dirt and blood from the dress, her only dress, 4 men from town came riding up the dusty trail to the ranch. Abel met them at the fence line. He wasn't holding an axe this time. He was holding a shotgun. They didn't get off their horses. One of them, a big man with a mean face she recognized from the crowd, spat on the ground. "She in there, Ward?" "She's where she belongs," Abel said, his voice dangerously calm. The shotgun rested easily in the crook of his arm, but it was pointed right at the big man's chest. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," the man sneered. Abel's eyes were as still and cold as creek ice. "You already did that yesterday. Now ride on before you make it worse." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Another one, younger and stupider, leaned forward in his saddle. "You siding with that thing? You know what she is." Abel didn't even blink. "I know exactly what she is. She's a woman who survived you." He took a deliberate step forward, the shotgun seeming to grow in his hands, and then, as quiet as thunder rolling in from a distant storm, he said it again. "She's where she belongs." The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. You could have heard a pin drop in the dirt. Then the big man finally broke. He jerked the reins of his horse, turning it around. The others followed, their bravado gone. They rode away without another word, and Abel didn't lower the shotgun until their dust was just a memory on the horizon. When he finally turned around, Mara was standing on the porch. She hadn't hidden inside. She had stood there and watched the whole thing. And for the first time since he'd met her, she wasn't shaking. She was crying. Great, silent tears rolled down her face. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of something else entirely. Something she hadn't felt in so long she'd forgotten its name. It was the feeling of someone finally standing in front of her, instead of on top of her. A few days passed in a strange, quiet rhythm. Mara worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, tending to the livestock, clearing the stubborn, rocky soil in a small patch for a garden. She worked with a silent, ferocious energy, as if she could sweat out the poison the town had poured into her. Abel worked alongside her, their silence a comfortable blanket between them. They spoke only when necessary, but they were learning each other's language in the way she handed him a tool before he asked for it, in the way he left a dipper of cool water for her by the fence post she was digging. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, they sat on the porch, cleaning their tools. Mara was running an oiled rag over a shovel head when she noticed something carved into the wooden handle. It was a letter, a small, simple D. "Daniel," Abel said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it. He hadn't even been looking at her, but he knew what she'd seen. She didn't ask. She just nodded and kept polishing the wood. But later that night, as she lay in the bed, listening to the sound of Abel's restless breathing from the floor, she thought about the little boy in the photograph. She thought about the empty space in the cabin, an ache that felt familiar to her. The next day, the sheriff came. He rode up alone, his horse moving at a slow, deliberate pace. He wasn't wearing his gun belt. He was trying to look friendly, but his eyes were hard and watchful. Abel met him at the porch, his stance casual, but his hand was never far from the rifle leaning against the doorframe. "Abel," Sheriff Lane said, tipping his hat. He didn't dismount. "Just came to see how things are." "They are," Abel said flatly. The sheriff's gaze flickered past Abel to where Mara was standing by the barn, watching them. She didn't move. She just stood there, tall and silent, her presence a challenge. "Look, Abel," the sheriff said, lowering his voice. "You gotta understand, people are scared. A woman that big, that strong, it ain't natural. And her husband, Silas, well, he had his troubles, but he was one of us." "And she's not?" Abel asked, his voice dangerously soft. The sheriff sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it would be easier for everyone if she moved on." "She's not moving on," Abel said. The words were final. The sheriff's friendly mask slipped. His eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake. You're bringing trouble on yourself. Besides," he added, his voice taking on a new, sly tone, "there's more to this than you know. Silas, he owed money to some very impatient people." Abel didn't react. He just waited. "They think maybe his wife knew where he kept his stash," the sheriff continued. "Maybe they had a fight about it. Maybe Silas's death wasn't just a simple accident. Maybe it was about getting that money." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. He was giving Abel an out, a reason to turn Mara away, a reason to save himself. But then the sheriff made his mistake. He pushed too far. "You know, it's funny," he said, trying to sound casual. "Caleb, Silas's brother, he says he was out hunting the night Silas died. Says he passed by Mara's place late. Real late." The air grew thick and heavy. "He said he saw someone leaving the cabin. Someone who wasn't Mara." The sheriff leaned forward in his saddle, his eyes locking onto Abel's. "Just for the record, Abel, where were you that night?" The question was a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. The sheriff wasn't just delivering a warning. He was fishing. He was building a cage, and he was trying to see if Abel would walk into it. Mara, from her spot by the barn, felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She watched Abel's back, saw the way his shoulders tensed. She saw the trap being laid. And for the first time, she wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for him. That night, the silence in the cabin was different. It was heavy, suffocating. They ate their simple meal of beans and stale bread without a word. The sheriff's question hung between them, unanswered. After they'd cleaned up, Abel went out onto the porch. Mara gave him a few minutes, then followed. He was standing at the edge, staring out into the impenetrable darkness, his shoulders slumped. "You don't have to answer him," Mara said softly, coming to stand beside him. "You don't owe him anything." Abel didn't turn. He's not asking for himself. He's asking for the town, for Caleb. "Caleb is a fool who hated his own brother," Mara said. "Maybe," Abel said, "but he's a fool with friends." He finally turned to face her, his face a mess of shadows and old pain. "He asked where I was that night. I heard him." "I was here," Abel said, "on this porch. I heard the shouting from your place. I hear it most nights." He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "I almost went over. I almost did, but I didn't." His voice was filled with a self-loathing that was ancient and deep. "When my wife and son got the fever, people said I was too proud to ask for help. They were right. I thought I could handle it myself. I thought I was strong enough." His voice broke. "I learned that night that not interfering, sometimes there's no right answer. You just make a choice, and then you live with the ghosts." He was telling her why he'd helped her. He was atoning. He was trying to do for her what he had failed to do for his own family. Mara's heart ached for him, for the terrible weight he carried. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she placed it gently on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him, but even as she felt a wave of gratitude and a strange, fierce protectiveness for this broken man, a cold sliver of logic cut through the emotion. Something was wrong. Something didn't fit. She thought back to her own cabin, the shouting, the fight, the fall. "Abel," she said slowly, her mind working, piecing things together. "My woodpile. It's on the north side of the cabin, the far side. You can't see it from the road." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible realization. "And the wind. It always blows from the west out here. There's no way. No way you could have heard him fall from here." His face was a mask in the moonlight. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His silence was a confession. "How could you have heard him fall, Abel?" she whispered, the trust between them shattering like glass. Doubt was a poison, and once it entered the bloodstream, It was impossible to get out. For 2 days, Mara moved through her chores in a fog. She watched Abel, studying him when he wasn't looking. Every gesture, every word, every silence was now suspect. The man who had saved her, the man who had stood between her and the mob, was a liar. But why? The not knowing was worse than anything. Was he protecting someone else? Or was he protecting himself? Did he see what happened and was now afraid of being called as a witness? Or was it something worse? The thought was a snake coiling in her gut. Did he have something to do with Silas's death? Did he let the town blame her to cover his own tracks? She had to know. On the third day, Abel told her he was riding out to check the fences on the far side of the property. He'd be gone until nightfall. The moment his horse disappeared over the ridge, Mara went to work. She didn't know what she was looking for, a clue, a sign, anything. She started in the cabin, going through the few possessions he had: old clothes, a box of letters from the war, his wife's sewing kit. Nothing. It was the sparse, clean life of a man who had nothing left to hide. Then she went to the barn. The air in the barn was thick with the smell of hay and animal sweat and old memories. Sunlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, illuminating dancing dust motes. She searched everywhere: the tack room, the feed bins, the hayloft. She found nothing but spiders and forgotten tools. She was about to give up, her frustration mounting, when her eyes caught on a loose floorboard in the back corner of the barn, half hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks. It was darker than the others, as if it had been pried up recently. Her heart started to pound. With trembling fingers, she pulled the sacks away and worked her fingernails into the crack. The board came up easily. Underneath, nestled in the cool, dark earth, was a small, bundled object. It was wrapped in oilcloth. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. It was a shirt, a man's work shirt, made of coarse, cheap cotton. It was stiff and stained with something dark. Blood. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew this shirt. The missing button, the tear near the collar. She had mended that tear herself just a month ago. It was Silas's shirt. She sank back on her heels, the barn spinning around her. It all came crashing down on her. The lie about hearing the fall. His sudden appearance in town after 2 years of isolation. The way he had taken her in, protected her. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't atonement. It was guilt. He had been there. He had killed her husband, and he had let her take the blame. The man who saved her was the man who had framed her. She was still sitting there, the bloody shirt in her lap, when Abel returned at dusk. He saw her from the doorway of the barn, saw what she was holding, and his face went pale. He didn't speak, just walked slowly toward her and sank down on his heels in front of her. The truth had finally cornered them both. "You were there," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," he said, his voice a raw whisper. "You lied to me." "Yes." Tears of rage and betrayal streamed down her face. "Why, Abel? Why would you do this? You let them strip me, spit on me. You let them call me a killer when it was you all along." "No," he said, shaking his head, his eyes pleading with her. "That's not how it was." And then, in the dying light of the barn, the real story finally came out. He had heard the shouting, just as he'd said, but it was worse that night. He heard things breaking. He heard her cry out in pain, a sound she had tried to stifle. And something in him, that part of him that had died with his wife and son, broke free. He couldn't stand by and do nothing again. He ran to her cabin. The door was open. He saw Silas, his face purple with rage, his fist raised to hit her again. Abel didn't think. He acted. He grabbed Silas by the shoulder and threw him back. "That's enough," he'd snarled. Silas, drunk and furious at the intrusion, had charged him. They struggled. It wasn't a fight, not really. Abel was stronger, sober. He just pushed him away, but Silas was unsteady. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling in a pile of firewood. He fell, just as Mara had said, and his head hit the chopping block with a sickening crack. He was dead before he stopped moving. Abel stood there, panting, looking from Silas's body to Mara, who was huddled in the corner, her eyes wide with shock. He knew what would happen. The town already feared her, whispered about her. They would never believe it was an accident. They would call it murder. They would hang her. So he made a choice. He sent her inside, telling her not to come out. He picked up Silas's body and moved it, arranging it to look like he had simply fallen. He wiped away his own footprints, but in his haste, he saw the blood on Silas's shirt, blood from a cut on his own hand from the struggle. He knew it couldn't be found. He'd taken the shirt, hidden it, intending to burn it later. He'd given Mara the story to tell, a story that was almost the truth, a story that would protect them both. He thought he was saving her. "I didn't want them to blame you," he finished, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to make it right." Mara stared at him, the bloody shirt clutched in her hands. He hadn't framed her. He had tried to save her, in the only clumsy, broken way he knew how. He had taken on the guilt of a killer to shield her from a town that would have shown her no mercy. But then, another colder thought entered her mind. There was still a piece missing. "Caleb," she said. "The sheriff said Caleb saw someone leaving my cabin." Abel's face went grim. "He saw me. I saw him up on the ridge, watching. He knows I was there." Suddenly it all clicked into place. The mob, the sheriff's visit, the constant pressure. It wasn't just about a town's fear of a big woman. It was being orchestrated. "He's not after me, is he?" Mara whispered, a new kind of terror dawning. "He never was." "No," Abel said, his eyes dark with a terrible certainty. "He's after me, and he's using you to get to me." The storm they had been waiting for broke the next morning. It didn't come with rain and thunder, but with the sound of hoofbeats and the shouting of angry men. Caleb had gathered his posse. There were at least a dozen of them, riding hard up the trail to the ranch. They weren't coming with questions this time. They were coming with ropes and rifles. "Get inside," Abel yelled, grabbing his shotgun from beside the door. Mara didn't argue. They slammed the heavy wooden door shut and barred it just as the riders swarmed into the yard. "Ward!" Caleb's voice roared from outside. "We know you're in there. We know what you did. Send out the witch and face us like a man." Abel peered through a crack in the shutters. The men were dismounting, taking up positions around the cabin. It wasn't a posse. It was a firing squad. "He's not going to stop until one of us is dead," Abel said grimly. "Why?" Mara asked, her voice tight with tension as she grabbed the old hunting rifle from above the hearth. "Why does he hate you this much? It's more than just his brother." "Because Silas talked," Abel said, his eyes scanning the men outside. "The night he died, before he charged me, he was drunk and bragging. He told me things." The first shot splintered the wood of the door, and they both ducked. The siege had begun. For hours it was a stalemate. The posse would fire a volley at the cabin, and Abel or Mara would fire a single careful shot back, enough to keep them from charging the house. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. In a brief lull, as the sun began to set, Mara was peering through a crack in the wall, studying the faces of the men outside. She recognized some of them, not just town drunks. She recognized Jed Miller, who ran the livery stable, and Marcus Thorne, who owned the dry goods store. They were the men Silas had always been in debt to, the impatient people the sheriff had mentioned. A sudden, chilling thought struck her. She turned to Abel. "This isn't about justice for Silas, is it? It's not even about you. It's about what Silas told you." Abel looked at her, his expression grim. "He told me their little secret. Silas, Caleb, the sheriff, and half the business owners in town. They've been running a rustling ring for years, stealing cattle from all the ranches in this valley, including mine. Silas was getting sloppy, scared. He was about to talk. His death wasn't just an accident I stumbled into. For them, it was a convenience. The pieces were all falling into place, forming a picture more ugly than she could have imagined. Caleb hadn't whipped the town into a frenzy to avenge his brother. He'd done it to create a smokescreen, to get rid of the one man who knew the truth. "They're not here to hang you for killing Silas," Mara said, her voice a horrified whisper. "They're here to silence you." Just then, another horse galloped into the yard. It was Sheriff Lane. For a heart-stopping moment, they thought he was there to break it up. But then he dismounted, took a rifle from one of Caleb's men, and aimed it directly at their cabin. He was in on it. He was there to finish the job. "We're trapped," Abel said, the last bit of hope draining from his voice. "No," Mara said, a fierce, determined light coming into her eyes. "Not yet." She looked around the small, dark cabin. Her eyes fell on the shelf, on the photograph of Abel's wife and son, and then to the small, dried bunches of herbs hanging from the rafters, Sarah's herbs. As a midwife, Mara knew what they were: sage, wormwood, yarrow, things for healing. But she also knew what they could do when they were burned. "Silas was always convinced I was hiding money from him," she said suddenly, her mind racing. "Not my savings, their money, the take from their last raid. He told me he'd hidden it somewhere safe." "Where?" Abel asked, confused by her sudden change of subject. "He never told me," she said, "but I know where he hid everything." She looked from the herbs to the fireplace. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in her mind. "The proof isn't just what you know, Abel. It's in my old cabin, and we're going to get it." The cabin door burst open, not with the force of an axe, but with a sudden, violent explosion of thick, acrid smoke. It poured out into the yard, a choking, blinding cloud that sent the posse staggering back, coughing and rubbing their eyes. Mara had thrown a bundle of dried herbs and sulfur she'd found in the barn onto the fire, creating a smokescreen that would have made the devil proud. In the chaos, Abel and Mara slipped out the back window and into the deepening twilight. They ran, low to the ground, using the rocks and sparse brush as cover, circling around toward Mara's old cabin. Behind them, the shouting and confusion grew. They reached the small, dilapidated cabin just as the moon was rising. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had lived here. The air was still and heavy with ghosts. "The floorboards," Mara whispered, heading straight for the hearth. "Under the loose stone." Abel helped her pry it up, and there, tucked beneath the dirt, was a small, heavy leather pouch and a thin, worn ledger book, the money and the proof. But as they stood up, triumphantly holding the book, a figure stepped out of the shadows of the cabin. It was Caleb. He'd guessed where they would go. He held a pistol, and it was pointed straight at Abel's heart. "I knew you were smart, Ward," Caleb sneered. "Just not smart enough. Give me the book." Suddenly another figure appeared at the cabin door. Sheriff Lane. They were caught between them. "It's over, Abel," the sheriff said, his voice cold. "Just give us the book, and we'll make your death quick." "And hers?" Abel asked, pushing Mara slightly behind him. Caleb laughed, a nasty, cruel sound. "The town already thinks she's a killer. One more body won't make a difference. They'll probably give us a medal." But just as Caleb was about to pull the trigger, a new voice cut through the tension. "I don't think so." From the trees surrounding the cabin, people began to emerge. Not a mob this time, just a few faces from the town. The blacksmith, the baker's wife, Daisy Harper, old man Clemens. They had seen the smoke from the ranch, heard the gunshots, and had finally come to see the truth for themselves. They had heard everything. The sheriff and Caleb froze, their faces a mixture of shock and fury. The tables had turned. The standoff didn't end with a gunshot. It ended with the quiet, damning words from the ledger as Abel read them aloud in the moonlight. Names, dates, numbers, an undeniable record of years of theft and corruption. The baker's wife, Daisy, was the first one to speak. I saw the bruises on you that night, Mara, she said, her voice shaking but clear. On your husband. He always had bruises from brawling. I never said nothing. I was afraid. I'm sorry. Then the blacksmith stepped forward, his eyes locked on the sheriff. He threatened to burn my shop down if I didn't look the other way when they moved the cattle at night. He said the whole town was in on it. One by one, the silence that had protected the guilty was broken. The posse, seeing their leaders exposed, lowered their guns, their faces a mixture of shame and anger at being used. Caleb and the sheriff were surrounded, not by enemies, but by the very neighbors they had lied to and stolen from. Their reign of fear was over. By dawn, it was all done. The sheriff and Caleb and their cronies were locked in their own jail, waiting for the federal marshal. The stolen money was recovered. The truth, in all its ugly detail, was finally out. Abel and Mara walked back to his ranch as the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air felt clean for the first time in years. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They stopped at the mesquite tree where Sarah and Daniel were buried. Abel reached down and pulled a single stubborn weed from the base of one of the simple wooden crosses. They'd have liked you, he said quietly. Mara just nodded, a lump in her throat. Later on the porch, he handed her something. It was a small piece of wood he'd been carving, a rough, hand-shaped figure of a woman. Strong shoulders, head held high. Unmistakably her. I'm not very good at it, he said, almost shyly. She took it, her fingers tracing the simple, powerful lines. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, she whispered. She looked out at the vast, open land, at the promise of a new day. She wasn't a widow anymore, or a monster, or a victim. She was just Mara, and he was just Abel. And together, they had survived. She leaned her head against his shoulder, not soft, but sure. And he didn't pull away. Because some stories don't need a happy ending. Sometimes, just an ending to the pain is more than enough. If you enjoyed this story, and you believe in the power of truth to overcome darkness, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on all notifications. We have so many more stories like this to share, tales of courage, justice, and the resilience of the human spirit. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's amazing to see how far a single story can travel, and how many lives it can touch. Thank you for being a part of this journey.